I am Aisha, 32 years old, and a data security auditor. For 5 long years, a mysterious stranger transferred $500 into my bank account on the first of every month. I never knew who it was. I assumed it was an anonymous grant for minority women in tech. But then one day, a lawyer called to tell me the sender had passed away and left me his entire fortune of $45 million. When I discovered the true identity of my benefactor, it exposed the darkest, most twisted rot hiding within my own family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who constantly underestimated your worth. Sunday dinner at my father Desmond's lavish Atlanta estate was always a theatrical production. My father, a prominent megachurch pastor, treated his sprawling mansion like an extension of his pulpit, demanding absolute reverence from everyone who entered. There were 50 relatives crammed into the grand dining room tonight. The air was thick with the rich, comforting smells of roasted turkey-collared greens, candied yams, and baked macaroni and cheese. Loud laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings as my aunts, uncles, and cousins gathered around the massive mahogany table. I sat quietly at the far end, picking at my food and trying my best to remain completely invisible. I was the designated outcast of the family. I was the quiet tech nerd who chose to build a small data forensics company instead of chasing the flashy camera-ready lifestyle my parents demanded of their children. At the head of the table sat my sister Gabrielle. She was 34 years old, flawless, excessively loud, and undoubtedly the golden child. Beside her sat her husband Trent. Trent was a 38-year-old white man, born into what he constantly reminded everyone was old money. He carried himself with a smug, unearned superiority that my parents absolutely adored. They practically worshipped the ground Trent walked on, believing his presence elevated our family status in the wealthy social circles of Atlanta. The dull roar of family chatter abruptly stopped when Trent stood up and clinked his silver spoon heavily against his crystal wine glass. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. With a dramatic theatrical sigh, he tossed it straight across the length of the table. It landed right on top of my plate, covering my food. I stared down at a personal check made out for $500. I looked up at Trent, completely confused by his action. He smiled a tight, condescending smirk that made my skin crawl. "Listen closely, Aisha," Trent announced, his voice booming, so all 50 relatives could hear every single syllable. "I have been more than generous with you, but the charity stops today. For the past 5 years, I have been secretly transferring $500 into your account every single month. I did it out of pity because your sad little computer job obviously cannot sustain a real adult. But Gabrielle and I are expanding her luxury spa brand right now, and we need to cut all unnecessary expenses. You are going to have to figure out how to pay your own rent from now on." The entire dining room gasped in unison. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I felt a hot flush of deep embarrassment rush to my face as 50 pairs of judgmental eyes locked onto me. I had always assumed that monthly deposit was a tech grant I applied for years ago. The horrifying idea that Trent, the man who belittled my career at every opportunity, had been funding my survival was completely paralyzing. Before I could even process the profound humiliation, Gabrielle burst into perfectly manicured laughter. "Oh my goodness, Aisha," she cackled, flipping her long hair over her shoulder and leaning into her husband. "You always acted so fiercely independent and so proud of your little startup company. Meanwhile, you have been surviving on my husband's handouts this entire time. It is honestly pathetic to look at you right now. You should be thanking him on your hands and knees for keeping you off the streets." I gripped the edges of the heavy wooden table, my knuckles turning stark white. "I do not want his money," I said, my voice trembling slightly under the weight of their collective stares. "I never asked for a single dime from him." My mother Valerie slammed her hand down on the table, silencing me instantly. "Do not you dare raise your voice to Trent," she scolded, her eyes flashing with pure disdain. "You have been a bitter, jealous child your entire life. Do you remember 10 years ago when I bought Gabrielle a brand new sports car to drive to her corporate internship? You threw a massive fit and packed your bags just because you were envious of your sister's success. You abandoned this family because you could not stand to see her shine. And look at exactly where you are now, sitting here, eating our food, and living off a wealthy man who took pity on your miserable existence. You are a disgrace to the family name Aisha. The loud murmurs of agreement from my aunts and uncles felt like a physical blow to my chest. They looked at me with a sickening mixture of disgust and pity, shaking their heads at my supposed failures. I did not scream. I did not cry. I pushed my chair back, letting it scrape loudly and sharply against the hardwood floor. I grabbed my purse and walked out the front door, leaving my untouched plate and the crumpled check behind me. The cold evening air hit my burning cheeks as I rushed down the sweeping driveway toward my old sedan. I fumbled with my keys, feeling entirely broken and defeated. My family had finally achieved their ultimate goal of completely destroying my dignity in front of everyone I knew. I unlocked my car door and slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the first tear finally fell. Suddenly, my cell phone buzzed loudly in my purse. I pulled it out and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. I answered it, taking a shaky breath to steady myself. "Is this Aisha?" a deep professional voice asked. "Yes," I replied, wiping the stray tear from my cheek. "My name is Attorney Holloway," the man said. "I am calling regarding the estate of your Uncle Silas. He passed away 2 days ago." I frowned, completely bewildered by the statement. My father had banished Uncle Silas from our family over 20 years ago. I barely remembered the man at all. Attorney Holloway continued, his voice serious and unwavering. "Your uncle left you his entire fortune, Aisha. $45 million. And there is one more thing I need to tell you. He requested I inform you that he was the one sending you $500 every month for the last 5 years. He wanted to make sure you were always taken care of." I sat frozen in my car, staring blankly at the dark dashboard. Trent had not sent me a single dime. My white brother-in-law had lied in front of 50 people just to humiliate me, and he had no idea what he had just unleashed. I sat frozen in the driver's seat of my old sedan. The cold leather of the steering wheel grounded me as I tried to process the words the attorney had just spoken. $45 million. It was a number so large it felt entirely disconnected from reality. But the second part of his message was what truly paralyzed me. Uncle Silas was the one sending the $500 every month. Trent had not given me a single penny. My arrogant white brother-in-law had stood up in front of 50 relatives and proudly claimed credit for my survival just to humiliate me. He had weaponized an anonymous act of love and twisted it into a public spectacle of my supposed inferiority. My breathing grew shallow and frantic. The sheer cruelty of the lie was suffocating. I looked back at the sprawling estate where my family was likely still laughing at my expense. My father Desmond was probably offering a prayer of thanks for his wealthy son-in-law right at this very moment. I shifted the car into drive and pressed my foot hard on the gas pedal. I needed to see this attorney immediately. The drive to downtown Atlanta was a blur of neon streetlights and blinding traffic. My mind raced through fragments of childhood memories, trying to picture Uncle Silas. He was my father's older brother, but his name was strictly forbidden in our household. Growing up, I was repeatedly told that Silas was a wicked man who had turned his back on God and betrayed our family. My parents used him as the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when you stray from the righteous path. They told me that if I did not follow their strict rules, I would end up destitute and alone just like him. It was a terrifying manipulation tactic that kept me compliant for years. Now I was rushing toward a high-rise building in the financial district to inherit his legacy. I pulled my old sedan into the brightly lit underground parking garage of the towering glass structure. My hands were still shaking as I turned off the ignition. I took a deep breath, trying to push down the lingering humiliation from the dinner table. Trent's smug face flashed in my mind. Gabrielle laughing at my expense. My mother calling me a disgrace. I rode the silent elevator up to the top floor, letting the smooth upward motion calm my racing heart. The doors opened to a pristine reception area adorned with dark wood and modern art. A receptionist guided me straight into a massive corner office overlooking the sprawling city skyline. Attorney Holloway was waiting for me. He was a distinguished older man with a calm, steady presence. He did not offer me platitudes or false sympathy. He simply pointed to a leather chair opposite his desk and poured me a glass of cold water. "You look exactly like he described you," Aisha Holloway said, taking his seat. "Silas always kept close tabs on you. He saw how Desmond and Valerie treated you. He saw how they favored Gabrielle and constantly pushed you to the side. He wanted to reach out, but he knew your father would make your life a living hell if he ever discovered you were communicating with the outcast of the family." I took a slow sip of the water, trying to steady my shaking hands. I asked Holloway why Silas had left me everything. I asked why he had hidden behind anonymous transfers for 5 long years. Holloway folded his hands on the heavy mahogany desk and looked at me with deep sincerity. "Because the fortune he left you is not just a pile of cash sitting in a bank account, Aisha. He left you a weapon. The $45 million is tied up in a highly aggressive holding company called Apex Vanguard. Silas built it from the ground up, completely in the shadows. He built it for one specific purpose." I leaned forward, hanging on to his every word. Holloway took a deep breath and began to dismantle everything I thought I knew about my father. 20 years ago, Desmond did not start his megachurch with a miraculous blessing from private donors like he claims in his sermons. 20 years ago, the family business was struggling. Silas and Desmond had inherited a modest commercial real estate portfolio from your grandfather. Silas was the financial genius keeping it afloat, while Desmond was obsessed with building a massive congregation and becoming a celebrity pastor. Desmond needed millions in seed money to purchase the land and build the sanctuary. When Silas refused to liquidate the family assets to fund a vanity project, Desmond took matters into his own hands. Your father forged documents and secretly drained the business accounts. When the auditors came knocking, Desmond expertly framed Silas for the embezzlement. He painted his own brother as a degenerate thief to the police and to the community. My stomach turned violently. My father, the man who preached about truth and integrity to thousands of devoted followers every Sunday, was a fraud. He had stolen his own brother's inheritance to build a monument to his own ego. Holloway continued explaining the dark history. Silas avoided prison due to a lack of hard evidence, but his reputation in Atlanta was completely destroyed. Desmond banished him from the family, using his newfound pulpit to publicly denounce his brother. Silas was left with absolutely nothing. But Silas was brilliant. He moved away, changed his professional identity, and started over. He used his unparalleled understanding of financial markets to quietly amass a fortune. He created Apex Vanguard and spent the next 2 decades buying up distressed assets, corporate debt, and leverage portfolios. He never married and he never had children. His entire life became dedicated to building an empire that could one day correct the profound injustice that was done to him. And he chose you, Aisha, to be the one to finally execute his vision. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the crushing weight of the betrayal. My entire life had been funded by stolen money. Gabrielle had grown up in absolute luxury, paid for by the deliberate destruction of a good man. She had been treated like a princess while I was treated like a burden. And my mother had proudly stood by and watched it happen, enabling the lies to protect her social status. Holloway opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick red folder. He slid it slowly across the polished wood until it rested right in front of me. I stared at the bright red cover, feeling a strange mixture of terror and overwhelming anticipation. The folder seemed to pulse with a dark, heavy energy. "Go ahead," Holloway instructed gently. "Open it." I flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. Inside were thick stacks of highly complex financial documents, banking statements, and mortgage deeds. I flipped through the crisp pages, seeing the Apex Vanguard logo stamped at the top of every single sheet. I did not fully understand the complicated legal jargon, but certain names jumped out at me in plain print. I saw the legal name of my father's sprawling megachurch. I saw the name of the exclusive private family trust that belonged to Trent. I saw the holding companies that funded Gabrielle's fake luxury lifestyle brand. I looked up at Holloway completely bewildered by the magnitude of the paperwork and asked him to explain exactly what I was looking at. Holloway smiled a thin, calculated smile. Your uncle did not just leave you wealth, Aisha. He left you absolute leverage. You see, over the past few years, Desmond has been secretly borrowing heavily against the church to fund his increasingly extravagant lifestyle. And Trent's supposedly wealthy old money family has been quietly drowning in massive corporate debt for over a decade. They are completely broke, Aisha, playing a game of smoke and mirrors to keep up appearances. Apex Vanguard aggressively targeted those specific debts through various anonymous shell companies. Silas slowly bought it all up piece by piece. You are looking at the master deeds and the promissory notes. Apex Vanguard now secretly owns the primary debt of your father's megachurch and the entirety of Trent's family trust. And as of this morning, you are the sole executive owner of Apex Vanguard. You hold the chains to their entire existence. Monday morning came with a heavy gray sky over Atlanta, but my mind was completely clear and focused. I parked my old sedan outside the modest brick building that housed my data security firm. It was a small, unassuming space with just 3 offices and a dedicated server room, but I had built it from absolute scratch with my own sweat and countless sleepless nights. I pushed open the heavy glass front door, fully expecting to hear the quiet, familiar hum of my cooling fans. Instead, I found a deeply disturbing nightmare waiting for me right in my own lobby. My father, Desmond, stood proudly by the reception desk, wearing one of his incredibly expensive tailored pastoral suits. My mother, Valerie, sat rigidly on my small waiting room sofa, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest like it was a protective shield. And leaning casually against the doorframe of my private office was Trent. His arms were crossed over his chest, and that same sickeningly arrogant smirk from Sunday dinner was plastered permanently across his pale face. He was holding a crisp white manila folder and tapping it against his leg in a slow, threatening, rhythmic motion. I stopped dead in the center of the room and quietly asked them exactly what they were doing in my office space. Trent pushed himself off the doorframe and took a few slow, deliberate steps toward me. He opened the folder and pulled out a thick legal document, tossing it onto the reception desk right in front of me so it slid across the polished wood. He proudly announced that he had just purchased this entire commercial building early this morning through his private channels. He bragged that it was just a minor cash investment for his massive family trust, but it gave him absolute legal control over my commercial lease. I looked down at the paper resting on the desk. It was a formal notice of eviction giving me exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises entirely. My heart did a strange, nervous flutter, but the fresh knowledge of Uncle Silas and the Apex Vanguard Empire anchored my feet firmly to the bare floor. I asked Trent why he was going to such extreme lengths to ruin my life when he had already humiliated me enough in front of our entire family. He laughed that sharp, highly condescending laugh of his and coldly told me that business was simply business. He then reached into the folder and pulled out a second document. This one was a formal transfer of intellectual property rights. He looked me dead in the eyes and said he was generously willing to tear up the eviction notice under one specific condition. I had to immediately sign over the exclusive rights to my proprietary data security software directly to Gabrielle's luxury lifestyle brand. He claimed her company was actively preparing for a massive tech valuation to attract new high-level investors, and they desperately needed my complex back-end software to make her failing vanity project look like a legitimate tech-integrated enterprise. He boldly wanted to strip away my entire life's work and casually hand it over to my sister just to falsely inflate her fake empire. I turned slowly to look at my parents, secretly expecting at least a tiny shred of parental defense or basic human decency. Instead, my father Desmond stepped forward and put on his deep, resonant preaching voice. He loudly told me that God commands us to honor our family and to willingly sacrifice for the greater good of the bloodline. He passionately said Gabrielle was divinely destined for greatness, and that my small software program was merely a convenient stepping stone for her inevitable massive success. He actually dared to look at me with deep pastoral disappointment and said that holding on to my professional pride was a terrible sin of vanity. He told me that a good Christian woman would gladly lay down her own selfish ambitions to elevate her chosen sister. My mother, Valerie, immediately chimed in, nodding vigorously at every single word my father spoke. She told me I was being completely selfish and hopelessly stubborn, just like I always was. She said Trent was being incredibly generous by even offering me a small chance to stay in the building he now owned. She firmly reminded me that Gabrielle's brand was the ultimate pride of our family, and that my data firm was just a silly little hobby that would never amount to anything truly important. She loudly demanded that I stop being a bitter, jealous sister and sign the transfer paper immediately so we could all just move on with our busy lives. The sheer overwhelming audacity of their demands hung heavily in the quiet air of my lobby. 24 hours ago, their combined cruelty would have broken my spirit completely. I would have cried and begged and desperately tried to explain the immense value of my hard work and late nights. But the heavy red folder that Attorney Holloway had given me was sitting safely locked inside my car trunk. I now knew for an absolute fact that Trent's family trust was entirely bankrupt and running on empty fumes. I knew that my father's massive church was drowning in secret, crippling debt. And I knew that Apex Vanguard, the shadow holding company I now completely controlled, owned every single financial chain that bound them to their fake lives. I looked back at Trent's highly punchable, smug face. He was so incredibly certain of his easy victory. He truly believed he had cornered a helpless poor black woman who had absolutely no options left in the world. He falsely thought his old money facade and my parents' blind adoration gave him supreme, untouchable power over my entire existence. I did not scream at them. I did not shed a single tear. I simply walked right past Trent without saying another word and went straight into my private office. The three of them quickly followed behind me like hungry sharks, circling their prey, fully expecting me to eventually break down and sign their ridiculous extortion contract. Instead, I calmly unplugged my personal laptop from the wall and placed it safely into my leather work bag. I gathered a few important personal items from my desk and neatly stacked them together in total silence. Trent laughed loudly, asking if I was really choosing to be completely homeless and unemployed over simply helping my own flesh and blood achieve greatness. I turned to him and softly said I would gladly leave the building today, but he legally needed to sign a standard temporary access form before he could safely evaluate my servers for Gabrielle's company integration. I told him it was just a standard security protocol to transfer the local network access over to his personal devices so he could properly assess the software he was trying to forcefully steal from me. Trent's massive ego was so incredibly inflated that he did not even hesitate for a single second. He eagerly snatched the printed access form right off my desk and quickly scribbled his signature across the bottom line. He practically gloated, telling me it was the smartest and most mature decision I had ever made in my sad life. He immediately pulled his sleek silver laptop from his expensive leather briefcase and connected it directly to my main server port, right there in my office, eager to dig into the digital assets he thought he had just successfully stolen from me. I picked up my heavy bag and walked calmly toward the door, leaving my enabling parents and my deeply arrogant brother-in-law standing in the middle of the office space I had painstakingly built. My mother called out after me, telling me to finally grow up and act my age. My father sternly warned me not to skip church service on Sunday. Trent just smirked down at his glowing screen, completely unaware of the absolute magnitude of what he had just done. He genuinely thought he was seizing control of my proprietary software to save Gabrielle's failing brand. He had absolutely no idea that the specific access port he just eagerly plugged his computer into was heavily laced with a highly advanced dormant Trojan horse virus I had coded years ago for security testing. By forcing me out and connecting his personal device directly to my isolated network, Trent had just willingly bypassed his own robust corporate firewalls. He had just ripped open the front door to his entire digital and financial life and blindly handed me the master keys. I drove a few miles away from my old office building and pulled into the fading parking lot of a cheap 24-hour diner. The gray morning sky matched the heavy feeling in my chest, but my mind was incredibly sharp and entirely focused. I ordered a black coffee from a tired waitress, taking a seat in a sticky vinyl booth near the back corner. I opened my laptop and connected to the diner's unsecured Wi-Fi, using a heavy layer of encrypted proxies to completely mask my location. The diner was empty, except for a few truck drivers eating breakfast in silence. It was the perfect quiet place to sit back and watch my digital trap finally spring shut. I typed a few lines of complex code into my command terminal, carefully executing the dormant backdoor protocol I had secretly buried deep within my proprietary servers months ago. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs as I waited in the dim light. I did not have to wait long. A small, flashing green light suddenly blinked on my dark screen, actively confirming that Trent had successfully connected my hardware directly to his private network. He was likely sitting in my former office right now, greedily trying to copy my entire life's work onto his personal hard drives so he could hand it over to Gabrielle. Instead, his computer was silently broadcasting every single keystroke, every saved password, and every encrypted file directly back to my machine. I bypassed his expensive but incredibly poorly configured firewalls within mere minutes. Trent always loudly bragged about his family's old money wealth, so I naturally expected to find massive offshore accounts and heavily guarded investment portfolios. I navigated straight into the highly restricted root folders of his private family trust network, eager to see just how much power he truly held. What I found, however, made me stop breathing for a fraction of a second. The grand sprawling empire of the almighty Trent family was a complete and utter illusion. I pulled up dozens of bank statements, filed tax returns, and hidden ledger files dating back over the past 10 years. His family had completely lost their vast fortune over a decade ago through a long series of incredibly arrogant and disastrous real estate investments. Trent's personal bank accounts were entirely overdrawn. He had massive outstanding loans with predatory interest rates that were actively threatening to crush him. The luxury cars, the custom-tailored suits, the expensive country club memberships that my parents constantly fawned over, they were all financed entirely on suffocating debt. Trent was not a wealthy savior gracing our family with his presence. He was a desperate bankrupt fraud desperately clinging to a dead legacy. But the financial ruin of my arrogant brother-in-law was only the very first layer of the sickening rot hiding beneath the surface. I dug much deeper into his recent transaction histories, meticulously following a dark trail of highly suspicious monthly transfers. Trent had somehow acquired top-level administrative access to the main financial accounts of my father, Desmond's massive megachurch. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I traced the digital money trail, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Trent had been systematically and intentionally embezzling millions of dollars directly from the church's weekly tithes and community donation funds. He was expertly funneling the stolen congregation money through a highly complex web of untraceable dummy corporations and dumping it right into Gabrielle's failing luxury spa brand. I sat alone in the dim diner, staring hard at the absolute digital proof of their massive crimes. My sister Gabrielle's highly publicized lifestyle brand, her flawless social media presence, her expensive boutique storefront. It was all entirely a complete sham, funded by stolen church money. Trent was literally bleeding, my father's holy sanctuary dry, just to keep his incredibly demanding wife comfortably draped in expensive designer clothes and the false illusion of success. And the most sickening part of all was that my parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on for it. They had blindly handed him the literal keys to their kingdom simply because he was a confident white man who played the part of a wealthy aristocratic son-in-law absolutely perfectly. They eagerly let him throw a crumpled $500 check right in my face to publicly humiliate me, while he was actively stealing millions of dollars from right under their incredibly oblivious noses. I drank my cold coffee and continued scrolling through the deeply buried transaction logs, feeling a cold, sharp sense of absolute clarity wash over my entire body. I was no longer the sad little sister they could casually kick around and discard whenever they felt like it. I was the silent, invisible observer, holding their entire fragile world right in the palm of my hands. As I manually refreshed the internal banking ledger, a new bright red flag suddenly flashed urgently across my computer screen. It was a pending offshore wire transfer scheduled to automatically execute first thing this coming Friday morning. I quickly opened the heavily encrypted file and my blood instantly ran ice cold. Trent was no longer just quietly skimming off the top to pay for Gabrielle's luxury handbags. The pending transfer was for exactly $4 million, which was the exact total amount of the megachurch's entire employee pension fund. Trent had quietly initiated a complete total liquidation of the hard-earned retirement savings of hundreds of faithful church employees. Attached to the massive transfer was a digital confirmation receipt for 2 first-class one-way plane tickets to a remote country with absolutely no extradition treaty. Trent and Gabrielle were actively planning to drain the church completely dry and permanently flee the country in just 4 days, leaving my father to face the absolute financial ruin and the inevitable federal criminal charges entirely alone. The sheer scale of their betrayal was almost too massive to fully comprehend. My father Desmond had spent his entire life building his church, focusing entirely on his pristine public image while completely ignoring the toxic dynamics within his own home. He had always believed that Gabrielle and Trent were the absolute pinnacle of success, while I was nothing but a shameful disappointment. Now his golden child and his perfect son-in-law were literal days away from destroying everything he had ever worked for. They were perfectly willing to let hundreds of innocent people lose their life savings just to escape the consequences of their own shallow greed. I closed my laptop and slid it safely back into my bag, leaving some cash on the table for the waitress. I walked out of the diner and into the cool morning air, feeling a profound sense of power coursing through my veins. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they had successfully paralyzed me by freezing my personal accounts and taking my office building. But they did not know that I now completely controlled Apex Vanguard. They did not know that I had the absolute power to freeze every single offshore account Trent was trying to use. The dominoes were perfectly lined up, and I was finally ready to push them all down. I drove straight from the diner to the exclusive Buckhead Country Club where my mother spent every Wednesday morning playing tennis and sipping expensive mimosas with her wealthy friends. I parked my beat-up sedan between rows of luxury SUVs and walked up the pristine stone steps of the clubhouse. My heart was heavy, but my intentions were pure. Despite everything Valerie had done to me, she was still my mother, and Desmond was still my father. The $4 million Trent was about to steal would permanently destroy our family name and send my father to federal prison. I foolishly believed that if I showed her the undeniable proof, she would finally wake up from her delusion and help me stop Trent before Friday. I found her sitting on the shaded outdoor patio, surrounded by 4 of her equally superficial friends. They were laughing loudly over crystal flutes of orange juice and champagne. I approached the table quietly and politely asked my mother for a brief private moment. Valerie let out a heavy dramatic sigh and rolled her eyes, making a show of apologizing to her friends for my sudden rude interruption. She reluctantly stood up and followed me to a secluded corner of the lush garden patio, her face already twisted into a mask of deep irritation. I pulled my sleek black tablet from my bag and urgently tried to explain exactly what I had found. I kept my voice low, desperate not to cause a scene. I told her that Trent's family trust was completely empty and that he was actively embezzling millions from the church pension fund to pay for Gabrielle's fake empire. I tapped the screen to bring up the digital wire transfer receipts and the one-way plane tickets showing her the exact proof of his plan to flee the country by the end of the week. I begged her to just look at the screen for 5 seconds so we could warn my father together. Valerie did not even glance at the bright screen. Instead, her eyes darkened with an intense, terrifying rage I had never seen before. She abruptly raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The loud, sharp crack echoed across the quiet patio, instantly silencing the chatter from the nearby tables. My cheek burned with sudden intense heat and I stumbled back in absolute shock, dropping my tablet onto the manicured grass. 50 pairs of wealthy, judgmental eyes immediately locked onto us. But my mother did not care about making a scene anymore. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face and viciously told me that I was nothing but a jealous, bitter black woman who simply could not stand the fact that my sister had successfully married a wealthy white man. Her hateful words hit me much harder than her physical strike. She loudly declared that Trent was the absolute best thing that had ever happened to our family, and that my pathetic attempts to frame him with fake computer files were the ultimate proof of my toxic envy. She called me a complete disgrace to the family name and furiously demanded that I get out of her sight before she had the club security drag me away. Before I could even process the profound depth of her blind betrayal, Valerie reached into her designer tennis bag and pulled out her phone. Right there in front of me, she dialed Trent's personal number. She put the phone to her ear and immediately began apologizing to him, warning him that his mentally unstable sister-in-law had completely lost her mind and was actively snooping around, trying to hack into his private business affairs. She assured him that nobody believed my vicious lies and promised they would handle my sudden erratic behavior. I did not try to argue or beg her to listen anymore. The absolute finality of her choice was crystal clear. She had chosen a lying, thieving stranger over her own flesh and blood, and she was perfectly willing to let him destroy our family as long as it preserved her precious social status. I slowly picked up my tablet from the grass and walked away, leaving her aggressively reassuring the very man who was currently robbing her husband blind. The drive back to my apartment was silent and cold. I was no longer a daughter trying to save her family. I was an absolute threat to them, and they were now treating me like an active enemy. When I finally walked through my front door, I sat down at my kitchen table and opened my laptop to check the Apex Vanguard security protocols. But something was horribly wrong. A bright red warning banner flashed across my banking dashboard. I quickly tried to log into my personal checking and savings accounts, but my passwords were all heavily denied. A sickening knot formed in my stomach as I opened my email and found a string of urgent automated messages from my financial institutions. Trent had not just brushed off my mother's warning call. He had immediately panicked, realizing that I was a very real threat to his $4 million escape plan. Utilizing his expensive corporate lawyers and his old money connections, he had swiftly filed a massive fraudulent police report against me, claiming I had maliciously hacked his private company servers and stolen highly sensitive trade secrets. The local authorities had immediately issued a temporary emergency injunction, freezing every single one of my personal bank accounts to forcefully paralyze me while they investigated his fake claims. Trent had brilliantly weaponized the legal system to completely strip me of my resources, hoping to leave me entirely helpless before his flight on Friday. He genuinely believed he had just checkmated me. The crushing reality of my frozen assets hit me the very next morning. I had barely slept, my mind spinning with Trent's incredibly calculated counterattack. Hoping a simple routine would steady my nerves, I walked down to the small corner cafe near my apartment building to get a black coffee. The barista, a young guy who knew my usual order, smiled and handed me the warm paper cup. I swiped my debit card on the terminal. It beeped loudly and flashed a bright red declined message. I nervously apologized and quickly pulled out my secondary credit card, inserting the chip with shaking hands. Another loud beep and another declined message. A line of impatient customers was forming behind me, their quiet sighs burning into my back. The barista looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance as I was forced to slide the coffee cup back across the counter and walk out into the humid morning air completely empty-handed. My phone vibrated violently in my pocket the moment I stepped onto the sidewalk. It was a text message from Trent. There were no words at first, just a high-resolution photograph of a pair of heavy steel police handcuffs resting on a pristine, polished desk. A second later, the text followed, stating that if I ever dared to come near his business or my sister again, those cuffs would be snapping around my wrists. He proudly boasted that his corporate attorneys were already drafting the final paperwork to permanently seize my data firm as compensation for my supposed illegal cybercrimes. He told me to enjoy being broke because by the end of the week, I would be completely erased from their world. I stood on the cracked pavement feeling entirely cornered. I literally had no personal money to my name. I could not buy food, I could not put gas in my car, and I could not even pay the toll fees to leave the city. Trent had successfully paralyzed my daily life, using the very legal system that was supposed to protect innocent people. The sheer speed and absolute brutality of his retaliation proved exactly how terrified he was of the secrets I had uncovered. But the absolute worst blow was yet to come. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy, suffocating heat over Atlanta. Knowing my family was actively trying to destroy me, I sat alone in my dim living room and pulled up the live stream of my father's massive megachurch service. I needed to know exactly how far they were willing to push this fake narrative. The sanctuary was packed with thousands of devoted followers, the bright stage lights shining down on Desmond as he paced back and forth gripping a silver microphone. My father did not preach about grace or forgiveness that morning. Instead, he used his holy pulpit to completely and utterly destroy his own daughter. He looked directly into the camera with tears glistening in his eyes and told his massive congregation that our family was currently enduring a terrible spiritual attack. His booming voice echoed through the massive speakers as he tragically announced that my heart had been completely poisoned by greed and that I had lost my mind to jealousy. He painted a horrifyingly fake picture of me as a bitter, unstable woman who simply could not stand the fact that my sister Gabrielle had married a wealthy white man and achieved incredible global success. Desmond solemnly told thousands of people that I had maliciously tried to sabotage Trent's honest business and that they had been forced to take legal action to protect their family from my toxic envy. He actually asked the entire congregation to bow their heads and pray for my sick, twisted soul. He called me a disgrace to the family name and publicly denounced my entire existence right there on the live broadcast. The fallout was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. Before the church service even ended, my phone began flooding with horrible messages from people I had known my entire life. Community leaders, former childhood friends, and extended relatives were all sending me vicious paragraphs calling me a bitter failure and a disgusting traitor. They completely bought every single lie my father sold them. The entire community officially turned their backs on me, cutting me off from anyone who might have offered me shelter or a kind word. I was entirely excommunicated, isolated, and financially ruined, all because I dared to step out of line and hold up a mirror to their profound hypocrisy. I turned off my phone and let it drop onto the floor. The quiet in my apartment was deafening. They thought they had broken me. They thought taking my small personal bank accounts and ruining my local reputation would force me to crawl away into the shadows and silently accept my defeat. They entirely forgot that I had spent the last decade quietly building my own strength while they were busy polishing their fake crowns. Heavy gray storm clouds rolled over the city, and the sky suddenly broke open, sending sheets of violent rain crashing against my windows. Without any access to money for a rideshare or a taxi, I had only one single option left. I put on my jacket, pulled the hood over my head, and walked out into the pouring storm. The rain soaked through my clothes almost instantly, plastering my hair to my face and chilling me to the bone. But I kept putting one foot in front of the other. I walked for miles through the flooded downtown streets, the heavy downpour perfectly matching the fierce storm of determination rising rapidly in my chest. I finally reached the towering glass financial building, completely drenched and shivering. The security guards in the lobby gave me strange, judgmental looks as my wet shoes squeaked across the pristine marble floors, but I did not care. I rode the elevator up to the top floor and marched straight past the receptionist, leaving a trail of dripping water on the expensive carpets. I pushed open the heavy mahogany door to Attorney Holloway's office without bothering to knock. He was sitting at his large desk reviewing a stack of paperwork. He looked up, taking in my completely soaked clothes and the fierce, undeniable fire burning brightly in my eyes. "My personal accounts are frozen," I said, my voice completely steady despite my shivering body. "My father just publicly destroyed my reputation, and Trent thinks he has successfully cornered me into absolute poverty." Holloway slowly set down his pen. He leaned back in his leather chair, and a slow, highly satisfied smile spread across his weathered face. He looked at me with immense pride and quietly closed the file on his desk. "Your personal accounts are currently frozen, Aisha," he calmly agreed, his steady voice cutting through the quiet tension of the room. "But Apex Vanguard's offshore accounts absolutely are not." He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a heavy silver security key, laying it gently on the polished wood between us. "Are you finally ready to unleash the $45 million? I reached out and picked up the heavy silver key from Holloway's polished desk. The cold metal immediately stopped the violent shivering in my hands. I looked at the man who had faithfully guarded my uncle's secret empire for so many years and told him I was finally ready. We spent the next 6 hours locked inside his secure private conference room, executing a mountain of heavily encrypted legal documents. By the time the violent storm outside finally broke and the evening sun bled through the tall glass windows, everything had completely changed. I was no longer Aisha, the disgraced daughter, or the frozen-out sister. I was now legally recognized as the Supreme Chief Executive Officer of Apex Vanguard. I controlled an untraceable, invisible empire of $45 million in liquid offshore assets. Holloway poured 2 glasses of scotch and quietly asked me what my very first official order of business would be. I stared out at the sprawling city skyline and told him it was time to buy the chains that currently bound my family. The next morning, I sat in my new secure office overlooking the financial district, actively directing Holloway's aggressive acquisition team. Trent thought he was a brilliant master manipulator, but he was actually incredibly sloppy. His wealthy family had secretly lost their vast fortune years ago, and he was desperately juggling highly toxic loans from extremely dangerous foreign creditors just to keep up his rich, aristocratic appearances. Using Apex Vanguard's massive leverage, I anonymously deployed millions of dollars to quietly buy out the remaining 20% of Trent's massive family debt. The foreign banks were absolutely thrilled to quietly dump his high-risk loans for cold, hard cash. Within 48 hours, Apex Vanguard silently held every single promissory note, every outstanding mortgage, and every predatory loan the almighty Trent family possessed. He was now completely and legally owned by a nameless, faceless corporate entity that I fully controlled. I held his entire financial existence right in the palm of my hand. But I could not just stop at the man who ruined my life. I had to permanently secure the powerful kingdom that had foolishly enabled him. My father, Desmond, had spent decades building his massive megachurch preaching about holy prosperity while secretly drowning in massive operational debt just to maintain his flawless public image. Holloway discovered that the megachurch's primary mortgage had recently been bundled and sold to a ruthless private equity firm in Chicago. I firmly instructed Holloway to execute a rapid hostile takeover of that specific financial portfolio. It cost me nearly $15 million of my uncle's money. But when the digital ink finally dried, Apex Vanguard was the sole legal owner of the sprawling megachurch property. I was now the literal landlord of my father's holy sanctuary. I held the absolute legal power to lock the massive glass doors, seize the glittering campus, and permanently foreclose on the entire congregation with a single keystroke. They had cast me out into the pouring rain and publicly humiliated me, but now I was their supreme overlord, holding the literal deeds to their pathetic illusions. And the best part was that they had absolutely no idea who was actually pulling the strings. I spent the rest of the week quietly watching them dance from the safety of my executive suite. My mother Valerie and my sister Gabrielle were completely oblivious to the massive invisible net closing tightly around them. Instead, they were incredibly busy promoting their latest grand illusion. Gabrielle's social media was absolutely flooded with glamorous announcements for a massive Black Excellence and Allies charity gala. The lavish event was being highly publicized as a monumental fundraiser to support marginalized youth programs with an aggressive goal of raising $5 million in a single night. But I had already seen Trent's encrypted files. The charity was a complete phantom. Trent had explicitly designed the entire gala to quietly funnel every single penny of those wealthy donations straight into the offshore accounts he planned to use for his permanent escape on Friday. He was going to bleed our community dry smile perfectly for the cameras and vanish forever. They had spared absolutely no expense for their grand finale, booking the most exclusive elite venue in the entire city for Thursday night. They bragged endlessly online about securing the Grand Sapphire Pavilion, a breathtaking multi-million-dollar estate that was famously impossible to book. I smiled a dark, slow smile as I pulled up the pavilion ownership records on my tablet. Gabrielle and Trent had signed a binding contract, paid a massive non-refundable deposit, and invited the wealthiest elite in the state. What they utterly failed to realize was that the Grand Sapphire Pavilion was a flagship property owned entirely and exclusively by Apex Vanguard. They were throwing their spectacular criminal heist right inside my own house. The very next evening, I was sitting on my living room sofa reviewing the final security arrangements for the Grand Sapphire Pavilion, when a heavy, aggressive knock rattled my front door. I calmly set my tablet aside. I already knew exactly who was standing on the other side of that door. The security cameras monitoring my hallway showed Trent and Gabrielle shifting nervously in the dim light. Standing directly behind them was a tall, gaunt man carrying a worn black leather medical bag. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute reality of my new power settle into my bones. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Gabrielle instantly pushed her way into my apartment, her face twisted into a mask of fake, tragic concern. Trent followed closely behind her, blocking the doorway so the gaunt man could slip inside before locking the door behind them. They looked like cornered animals, completely terrified of what I might do before their massive heist tomorrow night. Gabrielle immediately started speaking in a loud, trembling voice, clearly performing for the strange man standing behind her. She told me that they loved me so much, but that my recent erratic behavior was completely tearing the family apart. She claimed my wild accusations about Trent's finances and my sudden obsession with hacking into his business accounts proved that I had suffered a complete mental break. She reached out to grab my arm, playing the role of the devastated, caring sister perfectly, but I smoothly stepped back, completely out of her reach. Trent stepped forward, pulling a stack of official-looking legal documents from his jacket pocket. He handed them to the gaunt man, who finally introduced himself as a private psychiatric specialist hired by the family. The doctor did not even look me in the eye. He simply stated that based on the sworn testimony of my family members and my father Desmond's public denouncement, he was officially serving me with an involuntary psychiatric hold. He said my severe delusions about the church pension fund and my deep paranoia made me an active danger to myself and others. It was known as a 5150 order, and it gave him the absolute legal right to commit me against my will. They had arranged for a private ambulance waiting in the alley downstairs to transport me to a secure psychiatric facility where I would be forcefully held under heavy observation through the entire weekend. It was an incredibly ruthless and desperate maneuver. They wanted to lock me in a padded room, heavily sedated and entirely cut off from the outside world until their plane took off on Friday morning. Trent sneered at me, telling me that this was for my own good and that I needed serious professional help. He actually reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic syringe, telling the doctor to administer a mild sedative right now to keep me calm during the transport. The sheer audacity of their plan was sickening. They were willing to strip away my basic human rights and drug me in my own home just to protect their stolen millions. I did not scream or beg or try to run toward the door. I just stood there perfectly still, looking at the pathetic, desperate people who used to be my family. They truly thought I was just a helpless girl trapped in my apartment with no money and no allies. They believed that freezing my checking account and turning my father against me had left me completely defenseless. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Trent laughed, a harsh, cruel sound, telling me that my accounts were still frozen and that nobody in the community would ever answer a call from a crazy woman. He took a threatening step forward, reaching out to snatch the phone from my hand. I ignored his pathetic taunts and simply pressed a single large button on my blank screen. Instantly, the heavy, solid oak doors of my home office and my guest bedroom swung open. 4 massive, heavily armed private security contractors stepped out of the shadows. They were the absolute best elite operatives that Apex Vanguard's millions could buy, completely dressed in black tactical gear and completely silent. They moved into the living room with terrifying speed and lethal precision, instantly surrounding Trent Gabrielle and their fake doctor. The color completely drained from the doctor's gaunt face as one of my massive guards casually stepped between him and the front door. The doctor dropped his black leather bag onto the hardwood floor and held his hands up in absolute panic, backing away from Trent. Without a single word, the guard simply pointed a thick, gloved finger toward the open front door. The doctor did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He scrambled frantically out into the hallway and ran toward the emergency stairwell, abandoning his wealthy clients to save his own skin. Gabrielle let out a sharp, terrified gasp, backing heavily into the wall as the remaining 3 guards closed the tight circle around them. Trent stood absolutely frozen, his arrogant smirk entirely wiped from his face. His eyes darted wildly around my apartment, finally realizing that the helpless little sister he had been tormenting for years was somehow commanding a private army of lethal professionals. He looked at the imposing guards, and then looked back at me, his chest heaving with sudden raw panic. He tried to speak, but his voice completely failed him, catching in his throat like dry dust. I slowly walked right up to Trent, stopping just inches away from his sweating face. I looked deep into his terrified eyes, completely ignoring my sister, who was weeping quietly against the wall. I leaned in close so only he could hear me over the sound of his own rapid, shallow breathing. The Grand Sapphire Pavilion was fully prepped for his charity gala, and the trap was perfectly set. I whispered slowly and clearly, telling him that I would see him tomorrow night at the gala. The morning of the gala arrived with a crisp, clear sky over the city. I woke up early, feeling an electric anticipation buzzing in my chest. Tonight I was going to burn their entire fake kingdom to the ground, and I needed to look the part. For the past 10 years, I had hidden behind oversized sweaters and cheap blazers, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible so my sister could shine. I had allowed my family to convince me that I did not deserve to take up space in their glamorous world. Those days were officially over. I took a private car to the most exclusive designer boutique in the affluent shopping district. It was a place where appointments were required months in advance, and the clothes cost more than most people's cars. Holloway had already called ahead, using the immense weight of the Apex Vanguard name to secure the entire VIP fitting room for me. The boutique staff treated me like absolute royalty the moment I walked through the heavy glass doors. They offered me champagne and crystal flutes and led me to a luxurious private suite in the back of the store, away from the prying eyes of the regular clientele. I spent 2 hours trying on breathtaking garments, completely shedding my old, tired skin. My personal stylist brought out racks of exclusive pieces straight from the runways of Paris and Milan. I finally found the exact perfect weapon. It was a custom-tailored floor-length gown made of shimmering midnight blue silk. It draped perfectly over my figure, with striking sharp architectural lines that demanded absolute respect and attention. The delicate diamond embroidery along the bodice sparkled under the warm lights. I looked at my reflection in the massive mirrored wall, and for the first time in my entire life, I saw a truly powerful, formidable woman staring back at me. As the head seamstress was making a tiny final adjustment to the hem, I heard a very familiar shrill voice echoing from the main showroom floor. I stepped out of the private suite and peered down the brightly lit corridor. My mother Valerie and my sister Gabrielle were standing at the main register, surrounded by a mountain of garment bags and expensive accessories. Gabrielle was loudly demanding that the store manager wrap up a gaudy, heavily beaded white dress that cost $20,000. She bragged to the tired staff that she needed the dress for her massive charity gala tonight, where she would be hosting the wealthiest elites in the entire city. She spoke down to the retail workers with that same condescending tone she had always used on me, acting as if everyone else existed solely to serve her grand ambitions. The store manager politely smiled and swiped Gabrielle's shiny platinum credit card through the terminal. A loud, sharp beep echoed through the quiet boutique. The manager frowned slightly and tried the card a second time, resulting in the exact same harsh sound of rejection. I watched from the shadows as the manager's polite smile tightened into a thin line of professional discomfort. She leaned forward and quietly informed Gabrielle that the transaction had been completely declined by the bank. She gently suggested that there might be a daily spending limit, preventing the massive purchase from going through. Gabrielle's face flushed a deep, furious red. She slammed her hands down on the glass counter, demanding that they run the card again, claiming there must be a stupid machine error on their end. She yelled that she was Gabrielle Trent and that her husband was a millionaire who could buy and sell the entire store without breaking a sweat. My mother quickly pulled out her own credit card to cover the embarrassing public situation. She handed it to the manager with a tight, strained smile, assuring everyone that her wealthy son-in-law would simply reimburse her later. The manager swiped Valerie's card. Another loud beep. Declined again. Trent was entirely out of stolen church money, and his personal offshore accounts were completely frozen by my hostile takeover earlier that week. The realization of their sudden extreme poverty had not quite hit them yet. They still believed they were the untouchable royalty of the city. Gabrielle threw an absolute tantrum right in the middle of the luxury showroom. She shrieked at the cashier, accusing the boutique of deliberately trying to humiliate her before her big night. She loudly demanded to speak to the owner and threatened to ruin their business on social media with her thousands of loyal followers. Valerie frantically tried to calm her golden child down, looking around nervously to see if any of her wealthy country club friends were watching the pathetic public meltdown. I decided they had suffered enough in private. It was time to introduce them to the new reality. I stepped out of the dim hallway and walked directly onto the main showroom floor. The soft, midnight blue silk of my custom $50,000 gown flowed gracefully behind me with every step. The heavy silence that suddenly fell over the room was absolutely deafening. Gabrielle stopped screaming mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open as she stared at me. Valerie looked like she had just seen a ghost, her eyes frantically scanning my immaculate designer dress and my perfectly styled hair. They were completely paralyzed, unable to comprehend how the poor, disgraced failure of the family was standing in the most exclusive boutique in the city, looking like absolute royalty. I did not say a single word to them. I simply walked up to the register right next to my hyperventilating sister and placed a solid black metal American Express card on the glass counter. It was the ultra-exclusive Apex Vanguard corporate card, a financial instrument that commanded instant respect anywhere in the world. The manager recognized the heavy metal immediately, and her posture instantly shifted to one of profound deference. She quickly processed my massive purchase without a single issue and handed the card back to me with a deep, respectful nod. thanking me for my incredibly generous business. Gabrielle stared at the black card and then stared at my face. Her chest was heaving with a toxic mix of profound confusion and intense jealous rage. She simply could not process the reality standing right in front of her eyes. Her brain was short-circuiting, trying to understand how the sister she had just tried to lock in a psychiatric ward was now casually dropping $50,000 on a single dress. She stepped toward me, her hands balled into tight white-knuckled fists. She hissed through her perfectly veneered teeth, asking me exactly whose money I was stealing to pay for such a ridiculous dress. She accused me of committing massive credit card fraud and promised she would have me arrested and thrown in jail before the night was over. I picked up my heavy garment bag and looked down at my furious, desperate sister. The absolute power I held over her entire fragile existence was intoxicating. I smiled a slow, calm smile that made her take a sudden nervous step back. I simply looked at her and quietly replied, "I guess you will find out tonight." The crisp Monday morning air felt entirely different as I stepped out of my temporary motel room for the very last time. The long, agonizing weekend was finally over, and the beautiful trap was officially set. I did not wear the cheap, faded clothes Terrence expected me to wear. I did not look like the destitute, broken woman my family desperately wanted me to be. I had spent a small portion of my newly acquired personal wealth on a completely flawless, custom-tailored white suit. The pristine white fabric draped perfectly over my shoulders and completely changed my entire posture. I had my locks intricately styled into a gorgeous, immaculate crown resting proudly on the top of my head. I looked exactly like absolute royalty, and I felt completely untouchable. I carried a simple, slim black leather briefcase containing the absolute total destruction of every single person who had ever betrayed me. I walked up the massive marble steps of the federal courthouse with slow, deliberate power. The heavy wooden double doors of the courtroom swung open quietly as I stepped inside the echoing chamber. The large room was mostly empty, except for the specific people who had gathered to eagerly watch my final public execution. I looked directly into the wooden gallery seating area. My mother Vivian sat perfectly straight in the front row, wearing her expensive pearls and a completely smug, expectant smile. Aaliyah sat right next to her holding a designer handbag and whispering eagerly into my mother's ear. Paige was seated comfortably on the other side, wearing a light blue maternity dress and gently rubbing her slightly swollen stomach with a look of pure, absolute triumph on her pale face. They all turned their heads to glare at me as I walked down the center aisle. I saw their cruel, eager smiles instantly freeze and slowly melt into pure, genuine shock. They fully expected me to walk through those doors looking ragged, exhausted, and completely destroyed. Instead, I looked like a wealthy, powerful queen walking entirely unafraid into a battlefield. Terrence was already seated proudly at the large, polished mahogany defense table. He was wearing a dark, custom Armani suit that cost more than most people made in an entire year. He sat with his broad shoulders thrown back, projecting total, absolute arrogance to the entire room. I could see very faint dark circles under his eyes, revealing the massive panic he had undoubtedly suffered over the weekend, when his offshore proxy mysteriously locked him out. But his unyielding extreme arrogance convinced him it was simply a minor banking glitch that his wealth could easily fix. He genuinely believed he still held all the power in this room. Sitting right next to him was his incredibly expensive, high-powered white defense attorney. The older man looked exactly like a ruthless corporate shark, complete with a slick silver watch and a condescending sneer permanently painted across his deeply wrinkled face. I walked straight to the empty plaintiff table and sat down completely alone. I did not hire a lawyer. I did not need any legal counsel to translate the absolute undeniable truth I had resting securely inside my black leather briefcase. I was representing myself. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened, and the judge finally entered the quiet room. She was a stern older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that immediately took in the entire tense scene. She looked down at Terrence and his expensive legal shark, and then she looked over at me, sitting completely alone in my immaculate white suit. The formal legal proceedings began almost immediately. Terrence's high-priced attorney confidently stood up and smoothed the front of his expensive suit jacket. He addressed the judge with a smooth, polished voice that dripped with absolute arrogant condescension. He reached down and picked up a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He formally submitted a completely fraudulent financial affidavit to the court. He stood tall and boldly lied directly to the judge without a single ounce of hesitation or fear. Your Honor, my client has recently suffered a series of massive, devastating financial setbacks, the lawyer stated smoothly, pacing slowly in front of the heavy wooden defense table. His major commercial investments have completely failed due to sudden, unfortunate market shifts. He is currently drowning in severe, overwhelming debt. After a thorough and complete accounting of his personal and corporate finances, we have determined that the marital estate is essentially worth zero. The lawyer paused for dramatic effect, letting the massive lie echo through the large, quiet courtroom. Terrence looked down at the table, pretending to look completely devastated and deeply humbled by his totally fake financial ruin. The attorney then took a step closer to the judge's bench, raising his voice slightly to ensure everyone in the gallery heard his next cruel demand. Furthermore, Your Honor, given the fact that there are absolutely no assets to divide, we must immediately address the unacceptable behavior of the plaintiff. Ms. Amani has been acting in a deeply malicious and completely hysterical manner throughout this entire separation. She has routinely harassed my client and caused him immense emotional distress during his time of severe financial hardship. Because of her completely irrational behavior, we formally request that the court order Ms. Amani to pay my client's entire legal fees in full. A soft, satisfied gasp echoed from the wooden gallery behind me. Vivian and Paige were literally thrilled by the sheer, utter audacity of Terrence's brutal legal maneuver. They completely believed I was about to be entirely financially responsible for the very lawyer who was actively destroying my life. The stern judge slowly flipped through the thick stack of completely fabricated financial documents. Her expression remained completely neutral as she read through the massive, intricate lies Terrence and Carter had so carefully constructed to hide their massive wealth. The courtroom was absolutely dead silent, waiting for the final crushing blow to fall. The judge slowly lowered the fraudulent documents and folded her hands together on the high wooden bench. She looked directly down at me, sitting completely alone at the plaintiff table. Ms. Amani, she said, her voice ringing clearly through the large, quiet room, you have chosen to appear today with absolutely no legal counsel to represent your interests. You have heard the statements made by the defense. How exactly do you respond to the formal claim that the marital assets are completely zero? I did not panic. I did not cry. I looked back at Terrence, who was staring at me with a completely victorious, evil smirk. I simply smiled a bright, beautiful, warm smile and slowly reached down to click open the metal latches of my black leather briefcase, ready to show them all exactly who controlled the narrative and who truly owned the absolute ultimate power. The massive crystal chandeliers of the Grand Fellowship Hall cast a warm golden glow over the 500 wealthy donors seated at the banquet tables. I stood completely hidden in the dark shadows of the audiovisual control booth, watching the spectacle unfold on the stage. Trent was currently standing behind the clear acrylic podium, gripping the edges with both hands, as if overcome by the sheer weight of his own profound generosity. The 50-foot high-definition LED screen behind him displayed a glowing, serene image of the Church Foundation logo, bathed in soft, heavenly light. Trent bowed his head, allowing the expensive spotlights to catch the artificial tears shining in his eyes. He leaned into the microphone, letting his voice drop to a practiced, trembling whisper that echoed perfectly through the cavernous room. We are all called to bear the burdens of our loved ones, he told the rapt audience. We are called to be the safety net when those we love lose their way. I never planned to speak about this publicly, but true charity requires transparency. For the past 2 years, I have quietly carried the financial weight of my struggling sister-in-law, Aisha. She lost her way, and she refused to work, but family is family. Every single month, I have personally wired $500 to her accounts, just to ensure she does not end up on the streets. It is a heavy cross to bear, but it is my Christian duty to keep her from total ruin. A soft collective murmur of profound sympathy swept through the crowded ballroom. Wealthy parishioners dabbed at their eyes with expensive cloth napkins. In the front row, my entire family sat perfectly straight, beaming with absolute pride at the incredibly generous man my sister had married. My mother nodded solemnly, wiping away a tear of her own, completely buying into the tragic narrative that I was a destitute burden and Trent was a modern-day saint. I looked down at the glowing audio mixing board right in front of my hands. The young sound technician had stepped out for a bathroom break, leaving me entirely alone with the master controls. I reached out with a perfectly steady hand and placed my index finger directly over the main audio channel slider. I pushed it all the way down to 0. Trent was right in the middle of another fabricated emotional sentence when his voice suddenly vanished. He continued moving his mouth, but absolutely no sound came through the towering speaker system. The sudden dead silence in the massive hall was incredibly jarring. Trent paused, tapping the top of his microphone with his index finger. The dull thudding sound did not amplify. He let out a nervous, awkward chuckle and looked toward the back of the room, expecting the sound crew to fix the technical glitch. That was my cue. I stepped out of the dark shadows of the control booth and walked directly down the center aisle of the banquet hall. I did not rush. I walked with slow, deliberate steps, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor. I wore a perfectly tailored crimson suit that commanded absolute attention. The guests sitting at the tables turned their heads in confusion, watching me march purposefully toward the stage. As I reached the front row, my mother finally recognized me. Her expression of pious sympathy instantly dissolved into pure, absolute horror. My sister gasped out loud, grabbing her husband's empty chair. I did not even look at them. I walked straight up the short flight of carpeted stairs and stepped directly onto the brightly lit stage. Trent stared at me as if I was a ghost. His fake tears dried up instantly, replaced by a look of genuine rising panic. He took a small defensive step backward as I approached the podium. "What are you doing?" he hissed under his breath, leaning away from the microphone. "Get off this stage immediately before I have security throw you out." I ignored his pathetic threats. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small wireless remote control I had synced to the main projection system 10 minutes earlier. I picked up the spare wireless microphone resting on the lower shelf of the podium and turned it on. My voice broke the suffocating silence of the room, ringing out with crystal absolute clarity. "Trent is absolutely right about one thing," I said, projecting my voice to reach every single person in the very back row. "True charity does require absolute transparency. It requires looking at the actual numbers rather than listening to fabricated stories designed to manipulate your emotions and your wallets." I pressed the primary button on my remote control. The giant glowing church logo on the 50-foot screen behind us instantly vanished. In its place, a massive high-resolution image of Trent's personal and corporate bank statements illuminated the entire stage. The text was enlarged and highlighted in bright yellow so that every single financial transaction was perfectly legible to the 500 donors staring at the screen. The crowd let out a sharp collective gasp as the private financial documents were suddenly laid bare for the entire congregation to examine. Trent lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone from my hand. I easily stepped sideways, blocking his reach and turning my shoulder to shield the device. He was sweating profusely now, his expensive suit jacket suddenly looking completely suffocating. "Let us look very closely at the incredible generosity my brother-in-law just described." I continued, pacing slowly across the front of the stage and pointing a laser pointer directly at the massive screen. "As you can clearly see right here on line 4, there are indeed monthly transfers of $500 being routed to an external holding account. Trent has proudly claimed for 2 years that this money was a charitable donation to keep me from starving on the streets. He has used this exact story to secure his position on the charity board and to solicit endless sympathy from everyone in this room." I pressed the remote again, advancing to the next slide. This new document showed the final destination of the routing numbers, proving exactly who owned the receiving accounts. But as you can see by the federal banking routing data displayed behind me, I announced, my voice steady and unwavering, that money never went to me. It never went to any account with my name on it. I have never received a single dime of charity from this man. The $500 transfers were being routed directly into a private offshore proxy account registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, a shell company that Trent exclusively controls. The silence in the room was no longer confused. It was heavy, dense, and incredibly hostile. The donors were leaning forward, analyzing the glaring financial proof displayed above our heads. In the front row, my mother had covered her mouth with both hands. Trent was visibly trembling, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. He looked out at the sea of wealthy donors and realized his perfect, flawless reputation was completely incinerating in real time. But if Trent didn't send the money, where did it come from? I asked the crowd, letting the question hang in the heavy air for a long, deliberate moment. I turned my head and looked directly into Trent's terrified eyes before delivering the final crushing blow. And more importantly, where did the $4 million missing from the church's pension fund go? The Grand Fellowship Hall erupted into pure, unprecedented chaos. The elegant, wealthy donors who had just been weeping for Trent's fabricated charity were now shouting in absolute raw outrage. Heavy wooden chairs scraped violently against the polished marble floor as dozens of people stood up simultaneously, demanding immediate answers from the man they had trusted with their money. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Desmond, the senior pastor and head of the church foundation board, sprinting down the side aisle. His usually pristine clerical robes were flying wildly behind him as his face turned a dangerous shade of purple. He was waving his arms frantically at the empty audiovisual booth. "Cut the feed!" he screamed, his voice cracking with absolute panic. "Shut it down right now! Turn off that screen!" But the young sound technician was still nowhere to be found, and I had already securely locked the entire system from my remote access point. Desmond was completely powerless to stop the digital reckoning that was currently illuminating the massive room and exposing years of institutional corruption. I did not even flinch as Desmond tried to scramble up the carpeted stairs to the stage. I simply tapped the screen of my phone, instantly advancing the presentation to the next slide. The 50-foot screen behind me flashed with a new set of highly confidential banking records. These were the internal private ledgers of the prestigious church foundation itself, matched perfectly alongside Trent's personal banking details. "Let us follow the money trail," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly over the growing uproar of the betrayed congregation. "For the past 3 years, Trent has served as your chief financial officer, projecting the absolute perfect image of a selfless, devoted white knight protecting the church's sacred pension fund. But while he was standing at this very podium, asking elderly congregants to donate their hard-earned savings, he was quietly siphoning those exact funds into his own failing accounts." The screen displayed a complex, detailed web of wire transfers perfectly tracing the missing $4 million. Every single unauthorized withdrawal from the church pension account was directly linked to the holding company that managed Trent's supposedly wealthy family trust. The collective gasps from the audience grew louder and much more hostile. These were people who had blindly trusted him with their retirements, their community legacy, and their unwavering faith. The undeniable proof was displayed in high-definition detail, right before their eyes, showing exact timestamps and routing numbers. Trent had not just made a simple clerical error or a bad investment. He had orchestrated a highly sophisticated systematic theft to desperately prop up a family empire that had actually gone completely bankrupt years ago. "Your beloved financial savior has been completely broke since before he even married my sister," I announced, staring down at the front row where my family sat in absolute paralyzed horror. My mother looked as though the air had been physically punched out of her lungs. "He used your genuine faith as a personal piggy bank to maintain the grand illusion of generational wealth. He stole from the elderly, from the sick, and from the dedicated staff of this very institution just to keep his luxury cars in the driveway and his exclusive country club memberships active. Trent was entirely frozen in the center of the stage. He looked exactly like a cornered animal, his perfect custom-tailored suit suddenly looking incredibly suffocating. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of smooth corporate defense, but absolutely no words came out. His carefully constructed white knight persona was shattering into a million sharp pieces right in front of Atlanta's elite society, and he knew there was no escaping the digital evidence towering above him. But I was not quite finished yet. I tapped my phone one more time, shifting the massive screen to an entirely different set of extremely embarrassing financial transactions. And what exactly did our generous benefactor do with the rest of your stolen pension funds? I asked, stepping much closer to the edge of the stage, looking directly at my family. Did he invest it quietly into the community? Did he hide it away for a rainy day to protect his future? No, he did not. He used hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen church donations to buy something far more pathetic and vain. The large screen illuminated with dozens of receipts from shady international marketing firms and overseas click farms. These were clear, undeniable invoices for digital influence, proving a level of superficial greed that made the entire room sick. I looked directly down at my sister Gabrielle, who was actively shrinking into her expensive silk designer dress in the front row. He spent your retirement money purchasing millions of fake social media followers, fake engagement metrics, and completely fabricated sponsorship deals to fund his wife's desperate illusion of being a successful lifestyle influencer, I told the furious crowd. Every single luxury brand deal, every single lavish vacation post to Dubai, every single perfect picture she posted to make you all feel inferior was entirely financed by the money you faithfully placed in the church offering plate. The camera view on the massive screen zoomed in, highlighting the exact matching dates. Whenever Gabrielle posted a new milestone celebrating another million followers, a corresponding wire transfer of $20,000 was instantly drained from the church pension fund to pay the overseas bot farms. The room descended into absolute wild pandemonium. Wealthy donors were pulling out their smartphones, taking pictures, and recording videos of the undeniable proof displayed on the stage. Desmond had finally reached the stage, panting heavily and trying to physically unplug the podium's microphone. But I simply stepped away, taking the wireless mic with me, keeping my voice steady and clear as the chaos multiplied. The damage was already permanently done. The truth was out, and there was absolutely no putting it back in the dark. In the front row, the grand illusion of my perfect family finally snapped completely in half. Gabrielle stood up, her face contorted in sheer, utter panic, as the wealthy socialites around her began whispering, pointing, and glaring with pure disgust. Her carefully curated life of superiority had vanished in mere minutes, leaving her entirely exposed as a fraud who funded her vanity with stolen charity. She looked at Trent, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate need to save herself from the burning wreckage of their reputation. "Tell them, it is a lie," she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and entirely unhinged, cutting through the noise of the angry crowd. "Tell them you earned that money, Trent. Fix this right now." Trent looked at his screaming wife and then looked out at the furious, betrayed faces of his former friends and colleagues. The crushing weight of the absolute truth finally broke him completely, tearing apart the facade of their perfect, loyal marriage. He pointed a shaking, sweating finger directly down at Gabrielle, throwing her entirely under the bus to save himself. "She made me do it," he yelled, his voice cracking under the immense pressure as he backed away from the screen. Her fake lifestyle was bleeding me dry. Trent's pathetic, desperate confession hung heavily in the dead silence of the Grand Fellowship Hall. He was breathing hard, his face slick with panic sweat, as he cowered away from the very wife he had just thrown directly to the wolves. Gabrielle stood completely frozen, her mouth opening and closing as she stared in sheer, absolute shock at the man who had just publicly destroyed her. The crowd erupted into loud, furious murmurs, watching the perfect golden couple turn on each other like cornered rats. I did not give my sister a single second to recover her composure or play the devastated, betrayed spouse. I turned my attention fully to Gabrielle, looking directly into her wide, panicked eyes. I tapped my phone screen one more time. The massive 50-foot display behind me shifted instantly from Trent's offshore banking accounts to a highly detailed financial spreadsheet. It was finally time for my perfect, flawless sister to face the exact same bright, burning spotlight she had always ruthlessly aimed at me. For the past 4 years, Gabrielle has proudly flaunted her status as a self-made female entrepreneur. I announced, my voice echoing clearly through the towering speakers. We have all seen the endless social media posts about her exclusive luxury wellness spa in Buckhead. She has hosted lavish charity luncheons claiming to empower women in business, while subtly reminding everyone in our community that I was just a tragic, helpless failure who could not hold down a real job. The angry crowd turned their attention to the new federal tax documents glowing brightly on the massive screen. But true empowerment requires actual legitimate work, and as these certified business tax returns clearly show, Gabrielle's famous luxury spa has not had a single legitimate paying client in over 36 months. The wealthy donors squinted at the massive screen, absorbing the undeniable mathematical truth. I walked slowly across the wide stage, pointing a steady finger up at the highlighted columns. Every single dollar of revenue claimed by her beautiful, pristine spa was actually a direct deposit from Trent's offshore shell companies, I explained calmly, letting the harsh reality sink into the horrified audience. There were no wealthy clients booking premium massage treatments. There were no elite wellness packages being sold to Atlanta high society. The entire business is nothing but a carefully constructed money laundering front, specifically designed to wash the exact pension funds Trent stole from this very church. My sister is not a brilliant, successful entrepreneur. She is a willing, active accomplice in the largest financial theft this foundation has ever seen. She used your stolen retirement money to fund a fake, glamorous lifestyle while looking down on the very people she was robbing. Gabrielle let out a piercing, dramatic shriek that echoed terribly off the high, vaulted ceiling. She pushed her way past the empty chairs, violently stepping into the center aisle, so every single person could see her perfectly orchestrated performance. "It is a lie," she screamed, tears instantly streaming down her perfectly contoured face. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest, her voice trembling with manufactured agony. "My sister is completely insane. She forged these tax documents because she has been pathologically jealous of me her entire life. She has always been the bitter, toxic failure of this family, and now she is trying to destroy my beautiful marriage out of pure malicious spite. Look at her standing up there. She is just a jealous, vindictive liar trying to tear down everything Trent and I have sacrificed to build." My mother Valerie immediately jumped up from her front row seat, rushing to wrap her arms protectively around her weeping golden child. She glared up at the stage with absolute, unfiltered hatred burning in her dark eyes. "How dare you do this to your own flesh and blood?" Valerie yelled, her voice shaking with righteous maternal fury. "After everything Trent and Gabrielle have done to keep a roof over your head, you repay us with these fabricated, insane accusations. You are deeply sick, Aisha. You need psychiatric help immediately. Please, everyone," my mother pleaded, turning frantically to the shocked congregation with her hands clasped together in desperate prayer. "Do not listen to a single word this disturbed woman is saying. She is just lashing out because she is deeply unwell and cannot stand to see her sister living a happy, successful life." I stood completely still on the elevated stage, looking down at the two women who had spent my entire existence making me feel entirely worthless. 10 years ago, their unified public attack would have completely broken my spirit. I would have folded into myself, apologized profusely, and quietly accepted my familiar role as the damaged scapegoat just to keep the fragile family peace. But that broken, terrified girl was long gone, forever replaced by a woman who had spent agonizing months meticulously documenting every single shadow in their perfect glass house. I did not raise my voice or attempt to argue with their pathetic theatrical display. I simply smiled a cold, empty smile and lifted my cell phone directly to the microphone. You are absolutely right about one thing, Mother, I said, softly cutting effortlessly through their dramatic sobbing. I have been deeply jealous of the truth for a very long time, so let us simply let the truth speak for itself. I pressed the play button on my screen, holding the phone's small speaker flush against the professional microphone. A sharp crackle of static filled the massive hall, followed immediately by the undeniable crystal-clear audio of my mother and sister, talking privately in the sunroom of our childhood home just 3 weeks ago. I had planted the small recording device under the floral sofa cushions the day after Trent announced his magnificent charitable contribution plan. Gabrielle's smug, familiar voice suddenly boomed through the towering speakers, completely silencing her real-time crying. I cannot believe Trent actually pulled it off. Gabrielle laughed cruelly on the recording, her tone dripping with absolute arrogant malice. Everyone at the foundation literally thinks he is a saint for giving Aisha that $500 a month. It is the perfect cover story for the wire transfers, and the best part is that pathetic loser actually thinks she is just unemployable. The wealthy donors in the room stood completely frozen, listening in absolute horrified fascination as my mother's voice joined the recorded conversation. It is exactly what Aisha deserves, Valerie replied on the tape, her words laced with chilling, casual cruelty. We need to keep her feeling completely dependent and small. If she ever figured out she was capable of succeeding, she might try to overshadow you, Gabrielle. We simply cannot have that. Let Trent keep telling the church elders he is supporting her. It keeps the board off his back about the missing funds, and it ensures your sister stays exactly where she belongs, right at the very bottom of the family, so you can continue to shine. The recording clicked off, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence pressing down on the Grand Fellowship Hall. The absolute pure malice in their voices had been impossible to deny or misinterpret. It was not a forged document or a complicated bank ledger that required an accountant to understand. It was their own raw, unfiltered hatred echoing clearly for all of Atlanta high society to hear. Gabrielle stood completely frozen in the center aisle, her mouth hanging open as she realized there was absolutely no spinning or explaining away her own recorded words. Valerie dropped her arms from around her golden child, her face draining of all color as she stared around the room in sheer total panic. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and absolutely devastating. A wealthy, elderly woman sitting near the front, who had previously wiped tears of sympathy for Trent, slowly stood up from her chair. She looked at Valerie and Gabrielle with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. Without saying a single word, she turned her back entirely on my family. One by one, the rest of the elite congregation followed her lead. The wealthy donors, the church elders, and the prominent business leaders all silently turned their backs on Trent, Gabrielle, and Valerie, refusing to even look at them. The grand ballroom became a sea of rigid, rejecting shoulders, completely shunning the people who had so arrogantly betrayed their trust, leaving them entirely isolated in their own spectacular ruin. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sharp screech of microphone feedback. Desmond had finally managed to grab a working microphone from the sound stand. His chest was heaving, but he quickly drew himself up to his full, imposing height. He threw his shoulders back and summoned the deep, booming, theatrical voice he had used to control this congregation for over 2 decades. He pointed a trembling, rigid finger directly at me standing in the center of the stage. "Do not listen to this woman," he bellowed, his voice vibrating through the massive speakers and bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. "She is a vessel of deception and a demon sent here tonight to test our righteous faith." He paced furiously across the carpeted floor, positioning himself between the wealthy donors and the stage. "The enemy comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy," he preached, his face turning a deep, angry shade of red. "She brings forged documents and wicked lies to tear down the sacred house we have built together. Do not let this spiritual warfare blind you to the truth of our holy mission." I looked down at my father, watching him desperately try to use religion as a shield for his corruption. He was sweating heavily now, his clerical robes looking absurdly out of place against the backdrop of absolute greed. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of fear. I simply tapped my phone screen one last time. The massive projector behind me clicked, and the entire 50-foot display shifted from Gabrielle's fake business returns to a set of ancient yellowed legal documents from 20 years ago. The bold black letters at the top of the screen clearly spelled out the name of my late Uncle Silas. The congregation slowly turned back around, their eyes drawn to the towering display of undeniable historical fraud. "Let us talk about the truth of your holy mission," I said, my voice perfectly steady and piercing the tension in the room. "Let us talk about the original source of the money you used to buy this very land and pour the concrete for this sanctuary. For 20 years you have told everyone that Uncle Silas died completely penniless, and that you graciously paid for his funeral out of your own shallow pockets. You used his tragic story as a testament to your own deep Christian charity. But the certified banking records and the original unedited inheritance documents displayed behind me tell a completely different story." I pointed the laser pointer at the glowing screen, tracing the forged signatures and the illicit wire transfers. "Silas did not die broke," I explained, letting the heavy reality sink into the horrified crowd. "He died leaving behind a massive estate that was legally meant to be divided among his children. But you intercepted the legal notices, Father. You forged his signature on power of attorney documents while he was lying unconscious in a hospital bed. You entirely liquidated his estate and funneled every single dime into the purchasing fund for this church." I looked directly into Desmond's terrified, widening eyes. "You built a house of God on a foundation of absolute theft, Father. You robbed your own grieving family to build a monument to your own massive ego." Desmond stood completely frozen, staring up at the screen. The original documents, the banking trails, and the irrefutable evidence of his early crimes were completely exposed for the entire world to see. The donors sitting at the tables began to murmur again, this time, with profound anger directed entirely at the man who claimed to be their spiritual leader. Desmond let out a short, high-pitched, nervous laugh that sounded completely unhinged. He gripped his microphone so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "You have absolutely no proof of this," he stammered, his booming voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic whine. "Those are just old papers. They mean absolutely nothing. And even if you did have proof, it does not matter. I built all of this from the ground up." He waved his arms wildly at the expensive chandeliers and the grand walls of the fellowship hall. "I own this church. I own this entire congregation. I own this family. You cannot touch me." I looked at the frantic, desperate man who had spent his entire life making me feel like a worthless burden. I smiled a cold, empty smile and lowered my phone. "You do not own anything anymore." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the fellowship hall swung open with a loud, echoing thud that made my father physically jump. Attorney Holloway walked directly down the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes making a slow, methodical rhythm against the polished marble floor. He did not look at the gasping congregation or the weeping, wealthy donors. His eyes were locked entirely on my father. Holloway carried a massive stack of thick legal documents bound in heavy black folders. He walked straight up to the edge of the stage and forcefully shoved the entire stack directly against Desmond's chest, forcing my father to grab them before they scattered across the floor. "What is this?" Desmond stammered, his booming voice now reduced to a pathetic, weak rasp as he stared down at the terrifying legal seals stamped across the top folder. "That is your absolute financial ruin," I told him, stepping forward and looking directly down into his panicked eyes. "For the past 5 years, you all thought I was struggling to pay rent, living off the imaginary scraps of your fake charity. But while you were all busy congratulating yourselves for keeping me entirely submissive, I was quietly managing the offshore investments that Uncle Silas actually left behind. His estate was not completely drained when you forged those papers 20 years ago. You missed a secondary trust. A trust that I uncovered and legally claimed when I turned 25. A trust that has since grown into a $45 million private equity firm named Apex Vanguard." I let the massive number echo through the cavernous hall. My mother's knees completely buckled in the front row and she collapsed heavily into her chair. Gabrielle clutched her head, rocking back and forth in sheer absolute disbelief. Apex Vanguard, Desmond whispered, his face turning a sickening shade of gray. He looked frantically between Holloway and me. But Apex Vanguard is the firm that holds the primary commercial note on this property. I am the sole owner of Apex Vanguard, I announced, my voice ringing out with absolute unwavering authority. I bought your church's mortgage, Dad. I bought Trent's underwater family debt. I own the commercial loans on Gabrielle's fake luxury spa. I own every single financial obligation keeping this entire fraudulent family afloat. Trent let out a strangled sobbing noise, pulling at the collar of his custom suit as if he was actively choking. You cannot do this, Desmond yelled, waving the heavy legal documents in the air. We have a 30-year repayment plan. You cannot just call in the loans without cause. You defaulted on every single one of those loans the exact moment you embezzled those funds. I told him, gesturing toward the massive screen that still displayed the undeniable proof of their massive systematic theft. The morality clauses in those commercial contracts are explicitly clear. Any verified financial crimes committed by the borrowers result in immediate total default. I am not waiting 30 years, Father. I am foreclosing on everything, tonight. Desmond dropped the heavy stack of papers onto the stage. The loud smack echoed like a gunshot. He looked frantically at the exit doors, and then back at me, laughing a high-pitched, nervous sound that was completely unhinged. You have absolutely no proof of any of this, he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. And even if you did, I own this church. I own this family. I am untouchable in this city. I smiled a cold, empty smile, turning my attention toward the back of the massive hall. You do not own anything anymore, I said softly. Just as the words left my mouth, the towering stained glass windows lining the walls suddenly illuminated from the outside. Brilliant flashing red and blue lights began dancing frantically across the beautiful religious mosaics, casting terrifying shifting shadows across the faces of my completely ruined family. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the hall violently swung open again, revealing dozens of federal agents flooding into the lobby. The FBI had arrived. Dozens of men and women wearing dark tactical jackets with bright yellow FBI lettering across their backs swarmed into the Grand Fellowship Hall. Their heavy black boots pounded against the polished marble floors, creating a deafening military rhythm that completely drowned out the panicked screams of the wealthy congregation. The elite donors who had just spent the entire evening listening to my father's pious lies now scrambled desperately out of the way, knocking over expensive crystal centerpieces and overturning velvet chairs in their frantic rush to distance themselves from the stage. The flashing red and blue lights from the cruisers outside pulsed violently through the towering stained glass windows, painting the terrified faces of my family in harsh, unforgiving, alternating colors. I stood perfectly still on the elevated stage, watching the beautiful orchestrated chaos unfold exactly as I had planned it. I had not just brought the financial documents to the church tonight to simply humiliate them in front of their wealthy peers. I was never going to leave their punishment up to the internal church elders or a forgiving, naive congregation. Hours before the gala even began, I had transmitted the entire unassailable mountain of data forensics directly to the local field office of the FBI and the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I gave them the offshore account numbers, the forged signature analyses, the encrypted wire transfer logs, and the complete paper trail connecting my father's church directly to Trent's massive money laundering operation. The federal warrants for their immediate arrest had been signed and sealed by a federal judge before the first course of dinner had even been served to the oblivious donors. The lead agent marched straight down the center aisle, his eyes locked intensely on the stage. He held a thick stack of warrants in his left hand, and his right hand rested casually on his utility belt. He called out Trent's full legal name and my father's name, his voice projecting absolute authority over the terrified murmurs of the crowd. He ordered them both to step down from the stage and keep their hands clearly visible. Trent completely lost whatever tiny fraction of sanity he had left. The polished, arrogant investment banker who had spent the last 10 years treating me like a pathetic burden suddenly reverted to a cornered, terrified animal. He let out a guttural sound of pure panic and bolted toward the side exit. He shoved his way past a stunned church elder and aggressively knocked a tray of champagne glasses out of a catering waiter's hands, sending shattered glass flying across the carpet. But he did not make it more than 10 feet. 3 federal agents descended on him with ruthless precision. They hit him with the force of a freight train, tackling him hard into a beautifully decorated banquet table. The heavy wooden table collapsed under their combined weight, sending silver platters and half-eaten catered food crashing down onto the floor. Trent thrashed violently, screaming about his rights and his lawyers, but the agents expertly pinned his arms behind his back. The cold, sharp click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed clearly through the sudden silence of the room. Gabrielle watched her perfect, wealthy husband being ground into the ruined carpet, with his face pressed against a spilled plate of expensive food. Her mind completely fractured, unable to process the absolute destruction of her glamorous, pristine life. She let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek and decided to run. She turned sharply toward the opposite exit, completely forgetting the massive, heavy silk train of her custom designer gown. She took 2 frantic steps before the expensive imported fabric tangled tightly around her ankles. The sudden restriction pitched her forward, and the delicate stiletto heel of her overpriced designer shoe snapped completely off with a loud, audible crack. She hit the floor with a heavy, sickening thud, her arms flailing wildly as she slid across the polished marble. She landed face first near the front row of seats, her beautiful designer dress ripped and soaked in spilled wine. The wealthy, high society women she had spent years trying to impress and manipulate now stood completely silent, staring down at her with absolute, unfiltered disgust. Gabrielle lay there sobbing hysterically into the carpet, pounding her manicured fists against the floor like a petulant, spoiled child throwing a tantrum. My mother, Valerie, rushed toward her, crying out her name, but an agent quickly stepped between them, ordering Valerie to stand back and keep her hands visible. Trent was violently hauled to his feet by 2 large agents. His custom-tailored suit was ripped at the shoulder and covered in food stains. His face was red and streaked with sweat as they began dragging him toward the main doors. He twisted his neck wildly, scanning the room until his manic eyes found my father, who was still standing completely paralyzed on the stage, holding the foreclosure documents. "Desmond, you have to help me!" Trent screamed, his voice cracking with pure terror as the agents dragged him backward. "Call the bank right now. Wire the bail money. Call the best defense attorneys in Atlanta and empty the emergency accounts. Do it right now, or I am going to tell them everything about your offshore accounts and how you set up the fake charities." My father snapped out of his paralyzed state. He dropped the heavy foreclosure documents onto the stage and began frantically digging through the pockets of his clerical robes. He pulled out his cell phone, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. He tapped the screen desperately, opening his private offshore banking application to access the millions he had stolen from his own congregation. He stared at the glowing screen, and his jaw went completely slack. He tapped the refresh button again and again, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic. His eyes darted from the phone to me, and then back to the screen as if his mind refused to accept the numbers displayed in front of him. I walked slowly to the edge of the stage, looking down at the broken, ruined man who had built an empire on lies and theft. "You are wasting your time, father," I told him, my voice carrying easily over Trent's fading screams. When a commercial borrower commits federal fraud, the primary lien holder has the legal right to immediately seize all connected assets to protect the integrity of the loan. Apex Vanguard triggered that clause the exact second the FBI breached those doors. Your hidden accounts are frozen. Your emergency funds are locked. Gabrielle's fake business accounts are seized. You have absolutely zero access to a single penny of that stolen money. My father looked up at me, his eyes wide and hollow, filled with the absolute terror of a man who suddenly realized he was falling into a bottomless abyss. The federal agents began reading him his rights as they stepped onto the stage, their handcuffs catching the flashing red and blue lights from outside. They were completely destitute. The glorious empire of lies had finally burned entirely to the ground. 2 weeks later, the absolute silence of my new penthouse apartment felt like a heavy velvet blanket wrapping around my shoulders. I stood barefoot by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline. The city looked entirely different from up here, no longer a labyrinth of dark alleys and desperate struggles, but a bright, sprawling grid of endless possibilities. I had traded the suffocating shadows of my family and their total control for a penthouse suite that sat higher than the very church steeple my father used to look down on everyone from. The sharp electronic buzz of the security intercom broke the quiet tranquility of the morning. I walked over to the marble kitchen island and tapped the glowing screen. My building concierge cleared his throat, sounding distinctly uncomfortable. "Miss Aisha, I am so sorry to bother you, but there are 2 people down here claiming to be your parents. They are making quite a scene in the lobby and refusing to leave until they speak with you. Shall I call the police to have them removed?" I stared at the blurry security feed on the monitor. There they were, the great Bishop Desmond and the elegant First Lady Valerie. I could have easily sent them away and left them to the mercy of the Atlanta Police Department. But a part of me needed to see this. I needed to look them in the eye, now that the power dynamic had completely fundamentally shifted. "Send them up," I said, my voice perfectly steady. When the private elevator doors slid open a few minutes later, the sight of them almost made me gasp. The transformation in just 14 days was absolutely staggering. The polished, immaculate religious royalty had entirely vanished. My father was wearing a faded, wrinkled polo shirt and cheap khaki pants that hung loosely on his suddenly deflated frame. His face was deeply lined and covered in gray stubble, his eyes darting nervously around the luxurious foyer. My mother looked even worse. Her perfectly highlighted hair was flat and showing an inch of gray roots. She wore a plain gray sweater and scuffed flat shoes, completely stripped of her designer jewelry and arrogant sneer. They stepped tentatively onto the plush hardwood floors, looking around the massive penthouse with a mixture of raw awe and desperate hunger. "Aisha," my mother choked out, immediately bursting into violent theatrical tears. She took a step forward as if to hug me, but stopped when I did not move a single muscle. "Oh, my beautiful girl, we have been trying to reach you for days. The phones are all disconnected, and the lawyers would not tell us where you went." I remained standing perfectly still, holding a delicate porcelain teacup in both hands. "What do you want?" I asked, letting the coldness of my tone fill the vast open space between us. My father swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He wrung his hands together, completely abandoning his booming, authoritative pulpit voice for a pathetic, shaking whisper. "We need your help, Aisha. They took everything. The federal agents seized all the bank accounts, the church assets, the retirement funds. We have absolutely nothing left. Gabrielle is in jail. Aisha," my mother wailed, throwing her hands up to her face. "They denied her bail because she is considered a flight risk and an accessory to massive federal fraud. Trent is completely turning on her, trying to cut a plea deal to save his own skin. She is terrified in there, and the public defender they assigned her is completely useless. We need to hire a real defense attorney immediately, and the bank served us with a 48-hour eviction notice on the mansion. We are going to be homeless by Tuesday." My father took another desperate step forward, his eyes pleading with me. "We know you control the Vanguard funds now," he said, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "We know you have millions. We are just asking for a family loan. Just enough to get your sister out of that horrible cell and keep a roof over our heads while we sort this out. You cannot just abandon us to the streets, Aisha. We are your family. We raised you. Blood is thicker than water." My mother nodded frantically, wiping her tear-stained cheeks with a cheap tissue. "The Bible teaches us forgiveness," she sobbed, attempting to weaponize the very religion they had used to destroy so many lives. "We made mistakes. Yes, but we are your flesh and blood. You cannot turn your back on your own parents in their darkest hour. It is not right. Please, Aisha, just write a check and save your family. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I did not offer a single word of comfort or anger. I just stood there bathed in the morning sunlight streaming through the massive windows, completely untouched by their desperate, pathetic display. I slowly raised the porcelain cup to my lips and took a quiet, deliberate sip of my chamomile tea, simply staring at them over the gold rim as they drowned in their own spectacular ruin. I slowly lowered the delicate porcelain cup back onto its matching saucer, the soft clink echoing clearly in the vast silence of the penthouse. I stood up from my velvet chair, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that made both of my parents instinctively take a frightened step backward. There was no yelling. There were no hot, angry tears streaming down my face. I did not feel the familiar crushing weight of anxiety that used to suffocate me every single time they entered a room. Instead, there was only total, absolute control. My mother looked up at me with trembling lips, waiting for the dutiful, obedient daughter she had spent decades breaking down to finally cave and offer her a lifeline. My father watched my hands, hoping against hope to see me reach for a pen and a checkbook to save his ruined empire. They were so completely accustomed to my submission that they genuinely believed a few pathetic tears and the word family would magically erase 20 years of systematic psychological abuse and financial theft. You taught me a very important lesson growing up, I said, my voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any warmth. My words hung heavily in the bright sunlit room. You taught me that family only matters when they provide value. You taught me that love is entirely conditional, based strictly on how well someone can serve your pristine public image or inflate your massive egos. My mother opened her mouth to offer another pathetic excuse, but I took one single step forward and she immediately clamped her mouth shut, cowering under my steady gaze. You let Trent throw a $500 check in my face to humiliate me. I continued, my tone flat and unyielding. You stood in that church and smiled proudly while he treated me like a worthless charity case, using money that was legally mine to begin with. You let Gabrielle steal my peace, my dignity, and my inheritance, while you patted her on the back and called her your beautiful golden child. You built an entire glamorous lifestyle on the stolen foundation of my future, and you expected me to simply thank you for the privilege of being your scapegoat. My father actually fell to his knees right there in the entryway of my home. The great Bishop Desmond, the man who used to command a congregation of thousands with an iron fist, was now clasping his hands together in a gesture of pure, pathetic begging. "Aisha, please," he sobbed, his broad shoulders shaking violently as his pride completely shattered into pieces. "We have absolutely nothing left. The federal agents are seizing the cars today. The news stations are running stories about the fraud every hour, and my reputation is entirely destroyed. Gabrielle is sitting in a holding cell looking at decades in federal prison. We are begging you for mercy. We are your parents." I looked down at the two people who had spent my entire existence making me feel incredibly small and entirely alone. I searched my heart for even a single ounce of pity or lingering daughterly affection, but I found absolutely nothing. The emotional well had run completely dry. "You have no value to me anymore," I told them plainly, letting the finality of that statement crush whatever tiny fragment of hope they still held on to. "You are just two desperate strangers, standing in my home, asking for money you do not deserve." My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail, burying her face in her hands and rocking back and forth on the expensive rug. My father remained on his knees, staring up at me with red-rimmed, panicked eyes, still waiting for the miraculous rescue that was never going to come. I reached calmly into the pocket of my tailored silk trousers. I had been saving this specific item for exactly this moment, keeping it as a physical reminder of the exact moment I decided to stop being their victim. I pulled out the single crumpled $500 check that Trent had so arrogantly shoved at me weeks ago. The edges were worn and the paper was deeply creased, but his arrogant signature was still clearly visible at the bottom. I held it out loosely between my fingers. My father's desperate eyes locked onto the small piece of paper, confusing it for a moment with a real solution. I let the check flutter from my fingers, watching it drift slowly down through the sunlit air until it landed perfectly on the hardwood floor, right between his trembling knees. "Here is some charity," I said, turning my back on them and walking toward the massive glass windows to look out over my city. "It should cover a moving truck. Get out of my building." The heavy doors of my penthouse clicked shut behind them, sealing away their toxic noise forever. The next few months unfolded exactly as the federal prosecutors had promised. Trent could not buy his way out of federal racketeering and money laundering charges. His expensive defense team vanished the exact moment his offshore accounts were frozen, and a federal judge sentenced him to 10 hard years in a maximum security prison without the possibility of early parole. Gabrielle managed to avoid a prison sentence by loudly crying and agreeing to testify against her husband, but her new reality was a perfect cage of her own making. The former high society queen, who used to mock my perfectly tailored clothes, now worked the front reception desk at a cheap, loud strip mall nail salon. Every single piece of her designer wardrobe had been seized by the government to pay off victim restitution. Her vanity was completely destroyed. She spent her days wearing faded, oversized smocks, booking pedicure appointments for the exact same wealthy women she used to look down upon. My father lost his entire empire overnight. The church elders ousted him the very next morning, stripping him of his title, his massive pension, and his unearned pride. He and my mother were forced to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment on the far industrial outskirts of the city. My mother grew incredibly bitter. She spent her days sitting in a cheap, worn recliner, loudly resenting the man who had promised her endless luxury, but delivered absolute ruin. They had nothing left but each other and the suffocating weight of their shared misery. One crisp autumn morning, I drove out to the quiet, peaceful cemetery where Uncle Silas was buried. The air was cool, and the trees were turning brilliant shades of gold and amber. I walked slowly up the gentle green hill until I reached his simple, understated headstone. I knelt down on the damp grass and gently placed a single flawless white rose against the cold gray granite. I traced the engraved letters of his name, feeling a profound, permanent sense of peace wash over my entire spirit. I did not just get revenge against the people who tried to destroy me. I restored the honor of the only man in that family who ever genuinely believed in my potential. I protected his legacy, and in the process I completely reclaimed my own life. I stood up and brushed the grass from my knees, taking one last quiet moment to breathe in the fresh morning air. As I turned to walk back down the hill, my phone buzzed softly in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the bright glowing screen. "Transfer successful," read the bold banking notification. The first $2 million of the recovered Vanguard assets had just been officially deposited into a brand new charitable foundation. I was fully funding a comprehensive tech and business scholarship program exclusively for young African American women. I was going to make absolutely certain that brilliant, overlooked girls would never have to beg for a seat at the table ever again. They were going to learn exactly how to buy the entire building instead. I slid the phone back into my pocket and smiled, walking confidently toward my waiting car. The toxic cycle of generational abuse and emotional manipulation was permanently broken. My family had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, trying to convince me I was nothing but a worthless shadow. But I finally understood the greatest truth of all. The ultimate sweet revenge was not just destroying the people who tried to break you. It was walking away completely whole and living a beautifully extraordinary life